Throughout the history of the United States, many presidents have been seen over different lights throughout the years. Some, such as our beloved George Washington, have been seen as some of the greatest presidents, while others, such as Andrew Johnson, have been considered among the worst presidents in American history. However, which ones are the best? In this video, I'm going to be counting down my list for the top 10 greatest presidents in American history, with a few criteria. Number 1. Was anything really significant accomplished during their presidency? For example, James Garfield might be a well-liked president. However, due to his term being pretty short, he will not be included on this list because he didn't really accomplish anything. Number 2. Was anything negative accomplished during their presidency? And what I mean by that was anything negative happening during their presidency. Anything that looked like a sore thumb happened during their presidency. Pretty simple. Number 3. This is only counting their presidency, nothing else. For example, Jimmy Carter might be seen as an absolutely wonderful human being. However, due to the fact that his presidency wasn't ideal, he will not be included on the list. Also, one last thing. This is my opinion. If you have a different opinion or a different list, leave it in the comments down below. So, with that out of the way, let's get started. Coming in at number 10, we have James K. Polk, who was the 11th President of the United States, serving from 1845 to 1849. Now, originally, he wasn't supposed to be on the list, as originally, I didn't think he was on my top 10. However, after reevaluating, I do believe that James K. Polk is the 10th greatest president in American history. So let's go over some positives. First of all, he is most well known for annexing Texas, starting the Mexican-American War, and basically getting us what we now know as the U.S. Southwest. So, right out the gate, he seems like a pretty stand-up good president. However, just like all presidents, he had plenty of flaws, and one of the big ones was the expansion of slavery into these new territories. As a slave owner himself, Polk was in favor of slave owners expanding slavery into these new territories from Mexico, a country that had already abolished slavery all the way back in 1829. The issues over slavery in this new area caused many things, such as the Compromise of 1850, that led to California joining as a free state, and inevitably partially causing the Civil War. The fact that he annexed Texas can't all be chalked up to him, because 10th President John Tyler, throughout his presidency, wanted to annex Texas, which is something that put him at odds with the rest of the Whig Party, which as a whole was generally against the annexation of Texas and Manifest Destiny as a whole. So overall, James K. Polk was a good president. However, many of the after effects and other negatives of him make him no more than 10th place on this list, in my eyes. Coming in at number 9, we have James Monroe, who served as the 5th president, serving from 1817 up until 1825. A lot of people seem to overlook Monroe's importance to the country, but he was a significant president. Monroe is maybe best known for the president who resided over the era of good feelings, a period of nationalism in American history after the War of 1812, which lasted from 1815 up until 1825. Monroe was also one of 2 presidents in American history to go uncontested in an election, the other being George Washington, who, to be fair, was uncontested twice, but shut up! Perhaps Monroe's biggest accomplishment was the Monroe Doctrine, which was mainly created by his Secretary of State and future President, John Quincy Adams. It basically stated that the powers of Europe couldn't create any new colonies in America without going through the United States. Monroe also negotiated the Adams-Otis Treaty, which is the reason Florida is a part of the United States to begin with. Even though Monroe might have had a ton of success, a main downgrader for him was the Missouri Compromise, which basically stated that Missouri would be a slave state and Maine be created as a free state. As well, the new slave states could not be created above a certain point. This caused massive tension between free and slave states, and once again kicked the can down the road, the issue of slavery. That would inevitably lead to a civil war. So overall, Monroe was a pretty good stand-up president. Even though he made some mistakes, he still managed to make it onto this list. At number 8, we have William Howard Taft, who was the 27th president serving from 1909 up until 1913. In my opinion, Taft is a very underrated president who historians don't give credit to, even though he really deserves some credit. Taft was the president after the beloved Theodore Roosevelt. So naturally, it's going to be hard to follow up such an amazing president that Roosevelt was, but I think he did the job pretty well. During his presidency, he busted 90 trusts. And remember, he was only in office for one term. To put that into perspective, Roosevelt busted around 44 trusts, half the number that Taft did, and he had double the time. Taft also heavily enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and oversaw the breakup of the juggernaut that was Standard Oil in 1911. Taft is also the president who created the Department of Labor. Just thought I would throw that out there. Even with all the success, he had some failures. He was a bit indecisive on the whole legislative process. He had a failure for his Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909, which raised rates on many goods, and his dollar diplomacy around the world failed. However, his biggest mistake was being at odds with progressives. This cost him the 1912 election, as Theodore Roosevelt ran third party, which led Woodrow Wilson to win the presidency, who is arguably the most hated president on the entire internet. So overall, though many mistakes were made, William Howard Taft should not be as overlooked as he is, and he gets the number 8 spot on this list. At number 7, we have Harry S. Truman, who was the 33rd President of the United States, serving from 1945 until 1953. Truman is a president who is probably most famous for ending the Second World War. Just like Taft, he had to follow up another Roosevelt. This time, it was Franklin Roosevelt, who was in the middle of dealing with the biggest conflict in human history, World War II. With Truman wanting the least casualties to happen as possible, he dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which either way you feel about it, caused overall less deaths than a land invasion of Japan would have. Even though you could say less civilian deaths would have happened. After the war, Truman implemented the Marshall Plan, named after George C. Marshall, which helped fund the devastating Western Europe after the Second World War, and it was for the most part pretty successful. In doing so, Truman also helped found the United Nations, which is very important in mediating conflicts to this very day. Truman also implemented the Truman Doctrine, which said that if the United States saw communism, we're going to prevent it wherever we see it. Truman was also the first president since really Ulysses S. Grant who fought for civil rights, such as creating the President's Committee on Civil Rights in 1946. However, he had plenty of negatives, such as the corruption that was reported in his administration, the Korean War, which was pretty unpopular by the end of his presidency, and firing Douglas MacArthur, even though from a modern point of view, it was definitely the right decision. So overall, even though he left office with an insanely low 32% approval rating, he had an overall successful presidency that we still feel the positives of to this very day. Coming in at number 6 is Thomas Jefferson, who served as our third president from 1801 up until 1809. Jefferson is one of our most famous presidents, who accomplished quite a bit. However, possibly his biggest accomplishment was the Louisiana Purchase. By the time the sale happened, France was in the middle of dealing with the Napoleonic Wars, and there was great concern that was pretty prevalent that the British, who remember controlled Canada this time, would sweep through and take over the Louisiana Territory. Therefore, Jefferson bought the territory from Napoleon for around $15 million, which is around $400 million in today's money. He also sent out explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the vast areas, which allowed America to explore the animals and Native American tribes in that area. Though this was his biggest accomplishment, other accomplishments he had was reducing the national debt from $83 million to $26 million, created the West Point Academy even though he was against the state of the army, handled the Barbary Wars in such a way that showing America could fight their own turf, and ending the slave trade, even though you could argue it made slaves more valuable and prestigious than before the slave trade ending. But his biggest mistake was definitely the Embargo Act of 1807. The act prohibited all exports to other nations, specifically talking about Britain and France, which was mainly spurred on by the Napoleonic Wars, and America wanted to remain neutral. But the economy failed. the economy started to tank, and political backlash got so bad that when James Madison took office, he had to sign the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 to resume world trade with countries besides Britain and France. The damage was already done, though, and Jefferson left office as unpopular as he had ever been, but history has given us a spot on the top 10. Joe Jefferson was far from perfect. His policies are something that led him to be included on this list. At number 5 on this list, we have Dwight David Eisenhower, who is actually the most recent president on this list, serving as the 34th president from 1953 to 1961. Eisenhower might be best known for his World War II service, but remember the criteria. That wasn't during his presidency. His biggest accomplishment when he was president was the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. This act created an insane 41,000 miles of interstate highways going all across the nation. And this bill still impacts us to this very day economically and from an infrastructure standpoint. Other achievements that Eisenhower did was creating NASA in 1958, ending the deeply unpopular Korean War in 1953, expanding Social Security benefits, supported new civil rights acts in 1957 and 1960, fought communism all over the globe wherever he saw it, and he was the president during the 1950s. And you remember the 1950s, that's the time that Americans thought they could do anything, go anywhere, even though there was the threat of the nuclear bomb. However, not to say that Eisenhower didn't have negatives, he did. And the two main negatives were he started involvement in the Vietnam War. However, it's important to remember that the war didn't escalate until Lyndon B. Johnson's presidency when he enforced the draft and all that stuff. However, his main downfall was he started the planning for the Bay of Pigs invasion. Although the invasion did happen under Kennedy, Eisenhower actually started to plan the invasion all the way back in 1960. Therefore, even though Eisenhower made some mistakes along the way, all of his success, in my opinion, outshined the negatives, and his presidency manages him to land number 5 on this list. At number 4, we have the famous Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who served as the 32nd President of the United States from 1933 up through 1945. Roosevelt is probably the president who accomplished the absolute most. I mean, positive and negative things combined. And probably his most famous policy was the New Deal. The New Deal is Roosevelt's famous response to the Great Depression, and created things such as Social Security, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and plenty more. Though it's important to remember, the effects weren't felt immediately. But the after effects and the economic growth in the Truman and Eisenhower administration were large in part of them protecting the New Deal policies that FDR set up to deal with the Depression. Roosevelt also had some of the best leadership during World War II, using his power as commander-in-chief to help the Allies get supplies and beat the Axis power straight into the ground. He also used his fireside chats to tell the Americans his plan and reassure them that his plan would work. And, well, it did. His diplomacy around the world also helped in the creation of the famous United Nations. Also, just the fact that he got elected 4 times shows that people kind of liked him. And also, remember, all of his 4 elections were landslide victories against Herbert Hoover, Alf Landon, Wendell Willkie, and Thomas Dewey. However, Roosevelt, just like all presidents, wasn't perfect. And one of the biggest and most controversial decisions that a president has made, possibly of all time, were the Japanese concentration camps, or internment camps. This was absolutely the wrong decision and is a massive smudge on FDR's presidency. And I'm not going to make light of this. But this isn't like a German concentration camp during the Second World War. They are completely different. Like I said, I'm not making light of this. FDR 100% made the wrong decision when he did that. But just remember, it's not a German concentration camp. They're much different. Roosevelt also didn't help civil rights too much, especially compared to the next president, Harry S. Truman, and we've already discussed him, so no need to touch on him more. Roosevelt also tried to pack the Supreme Court with people so he would have more success with his New Deal policy, which was, So overall, even though many mistakes were made, he accomplished so many positives that, for the most part, keep in mind the words, for the most part, they overshadow what he did in his negatives. And he lands number 4 on this list. Now, we're in the top 3. And in third place, we have the absolutely famous Theodore Roosevelt, who was the 26th President of the United States, serving from 1901 up through 1909. Roosevelt seems to be a pretty popular and great president for good reason, and one of, if not his biggest accomplishment, was the passing of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. These created what we now know as the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. What these did is ensure the health and safety of Americans when they eat food, because, if we didn't have the FDA, we're going to be over here getting sick all the time. Roosevelt also implemented what he called the Square Deal, something that inspired FDR's New Deal, which we already discussed. And it was a whole progressive reform which included breaking up the monopolies, environmental conservation, protecting consumer rights, labor rights, and plenty more. Roosevelt fundamentally changed the way the presidency worked. He used what is known as the bully pulpit to basically get his agenda out, using his power as the president to basically say, hey, this is my agenda. I'm not going to be pushed aside. Because before Roosevelt, it was mainly Congress putting in a bunch of laws. But when Roosevelt got in, he made the presidency the main power, not Congress. Roosevelt also facilitated the construction of the Panama Canal, and his foreign policy of speak softly and carry a big stick helped increase American influence around the globe. Roosevelt is also an environmental person who created 5 national parks, more than any other president in American history. Roosevelt also busted 44 trusts. Even though his successor, William Howard Taft, busted more, Roosevelt was the one who created the whole thing, and he still trust busted. Taft, I have to ask you to leave. Get out of here. Something that both Roosevelts fall short on is civil rights. Just like Franklin, Theodore didn't do much for civil rights. In fact, he had like a whole hierarchy thing. Nobody really in this time period didn't really do anything for civil rights though, but you get the point. Another negative is he supported the removal of Native Americans and gave 86 million acres of their land to the National Forest System. So overall, Theodore Roosevelt's time in office was one of the best presidencies we've ever had, landing him over here in the top 3 of this list. At number 2, we have the one, the only, Abraham Lincoln. And I think by this point, you can already see who's going to be number 1. Lincoln might have been the most adept politician to ever serve as president. He was excellent at getting his word and his policy out there. This is a time before the radio fireside chats that FDR had. He got his agenda out there. He kept the nation together in a time of uncertainty. It was tearing itself apart using the Civil War. And when Northern soldiers got demoralized, Lincoln used his power to boost morale and eventually got us victory in the Civil War. Lincoln also heavily pushed for the 13th Amendment, and I'm pretty sure by the time he died, he would have probably killed somebody for that amendment to pass. Unfortunately, it was ratified under the worst president in American history, Andrew Johnson. Get the heck off the screen! Sorry about that. Lincoln, also to the dismay of many people, Mr. B, suspended habeas corpus. However, in the Constitution, it does state that habeas corpus could not be suspended unless in cases of rebellion. And last time I checked, I think the Civil War was a rebellion. Lincoln kept the country together. He was literally the glue that kept it together while it was coming apart at the seams. The Emancipation Proclamation, although it was just a war measure, did indeed free the slaves, as generals such as Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman moved through Confederate territory and liberated slaves. I could go on and on about Lincoln's achievements, but I think you get the broader picture. Lincoln is not only one of the most famous presidents we've had, but is also one of the best politicians and presidents we've ever had in American history. And because of all that, he gets number 2 on this list. Now, before we get to number 1, let's look at some honorable mentions who didn't quite make the list. Now, originally, Ulysses S. Grant was actually going to be number 10, and I reconsidered. I looked at stuff like the Panic of 1873, the corruption in his cabinet that he wasn't a part of, and he got taken off the list. But, in my opinion, he's still the 11th or 12th greatest president in American history. Ronald Reagan, he wasn't going to be on the list, but he's still an honorable mention. And, he was originally on my top 10, but he got taken off after I looked at stuff like the AIDS crisis and Iran-Contra. That really bumped it down for me, but he's 12th or 13th. And finally, for the honorable mentions, Calvin Coolidge. Just like Grant, he was also originally going to be on the list, but I looked at a lot of stuff, and he unfortunately got removed. He's below Reagan, similar to Reagan. It's Reagan's favorite president, too. And yeah, that's about it for the honorable mentions. Now we get to the top pick. Now, we're here at number 1. This one probably won't surprise any of you, but number 1 is simple. It's George Washington. Now, you might be saying, this is so unoriginal. Maybe, but hear me out here. Washington was the beloved first president serving from 1789 up through 1797. What he's mainly known for his presidents, but he didn't just do that. He kept the country together. Remember, before the Constitution, we had the Articles of Confederation, and that made the country, so weak. We basically didn't even have a federal government. And countries such as Britain and France were taking interest in us because they thought we would collapse at any moment now, and they could take us. Enter George Washington. George Washington used his power and his fame as the leader of the Continental Army, became president, and after he left the presidency, he had united the country so well that when John Adams took office, the country was all united because of the work that Washington had done to keep it united. Alright, Adams, that's all we need from you. Get out of here. Obviously, he set a whole bunch of precedents. That's what he's mainly known for. Being called Mr. President, the Whiskey Rebellion, where he set the precedent of using military force to intercourse in rebellions, and most importantly, he stepped down. People like Alexander Hamilton, if he ever had the chance, he would have made George Washington a king. But Washington said, no, I don't want to be a king. Washington wanted to be a president. He didn't want to be any more. He didn't want these royal titles that John Adams tried to give him. He didn't want to be a king. He didn't want to be called a king. He wanted to be called a president. And remember, president didn't have a lot of prestige. Some people are like, are you sure? And he's like, I'm confident. I don't want to be called a king. I want to be called a president. And to this day, it stuck. So many people like Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, Thomas Jefferson, all those people, they've taken it. Every single president in American history has taken some sort of inspiration from Washington because that's how influential he was. He's not just the best because he was the first. He's the best because if Washington was never born or never became president, there wouldn't be a president or a United States in general. So, there you have it. That was my list for the top 10 greatest presidents in American history. From the highest highs to the lowest lows, these men have defined the United States as a whole. And now we celebrate them. Happy President's Day, everybody. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.